Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Public Library. It's so nice to have everyone with us tonight. There are two events going on at the library this week. Our reference librarian, Jeremy Robichaud, will lead a workshop, Search the Catalog Like a Pro. That's on Thursday at noon, and you'll find the registration link in the chat. And then on Saturday from 10 to 1, the Friends of the Library will hold an outdoor book sale in the library parking lot. So I hope you can make it to that and stock up on books for summer reading. So on to tonight's program. Everyone should have a handout that was sent in the email with your Zoom link. So watch for that. And Pam has asked that we have questions at the end of her talk. So save up your questions, but if you'd like, feel free to add them to the chat as we go along, so you don't forget. And just a request that everyone stay muted during the presentation. Okay, let's get started. We are delighted tonight to have Pamela Guye Holland here to talk about using DNA testing data to find cousins and expand our family trees. Pam is a professional genealogist located in Swampscott. Her research specialties are Irish and genetic genealogy. She also has expertise in New England, New York City, New York State, and German research. And she's been conducting genealogical research since 2001. She works with private clients and as a research services genealogist at NEHGS and as a green room genealogist for Your Irish Heritage. Welcome, Pam. It's lovely to have you with us tonight.
Thank you.
I'm going to switch over the spotlight. Okay.
There. So how is that? I think everyone can see that.
Looks good.
Good. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to Finding Cousins Using DNA. So once you submit a DNA sample to be tested, the testing companies compare your DNA to DNA samples in their company's database. And depending on the type of test you have purchased, they report the resulting matches they have found back to you. These results do not tell you which ancestor you and your DNA match share. That's really up to you and your match to figure out. The best case scenario is that you and your match have both thoroughly researched your families, and then you can find a common ancestor. However, that's often not the case. So this talk will illustrate some methods that can help you when you work with your DNA matches. So what we'll be covering tonight, we'll go over some basics of genetic genealogy. We'll talk about your ethnicity results, and then we'll get into the DNA matches themselves. I'll go through some best practices and how to work with your DNA results. And then I'll go through some quick little examples that maybe will be useful to you. But I just want to let you know that I will not be covering GEDmatch or any other third-party sites. At the moment, there are 5 major DNA testing companies that genealogists use. They are AncestryDNA, FamilyTreeDNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Living DNA. Now, Living DNA is a new company, and it's kind of slowly providing some matching, but I think it's going to be a while before there really is as useful as the other 4 companies. So as a result, I'm not going to be talking about them anymore tonight or in this lecture. All the companies test your autosomal DNA, and they provide information on your ethnicity and those you match in their database. They also provide different tools to work with your matches. And we'll be going over some of those tools as well. But first, I want to cover some of the DNA basics that will help you to understand your DNA results. Every cell in your body contains DNA, and within each cell is a nucleus. And within that nucleus, you will find your chromosomes. Each of these chromosomes is made up of proteins of DNA, and that DNA is represented by the double helix that you see here. Each of us has 23 pairs of chromosomes that define who we are. They're represented by these rectangular pairs. The first 22 pairs are called autosomal DNA, The last pair that I've circled in red determines your sex, and it's either XY for a male or XX for a female. We also have another kind of DNA called mitochondrial DNA. It's different than the chromosome DNA, and it's actually found outside the nucleus of the cell. Now, there's a lot to learn about DNA, and these are just some really quick basics, but I just wanted to go over them just have a little bit of a foundation. But if you're not familiar with some of these concepts that I'm going to be talking about, don't worry. You can find more information in the links in your handout. And I've also included some blogs that you can read up on if you want to get more details if you're interested. Autosomal testing looks at small little pieces of your DNA called, excuse me, SNP or SNPs, and that stands for singular nucleotide polymorphisms. And these SNPs are taken from all 22 chromosome pairs and your X chromosome. However, these SNP locations only represent a fraction of your DNA. And you would actually have to do a full genome sequencing to capture all of your DNA. And while that's possible these days, and it's not as crazy expensive as it used to be, it's really mainly for those seeking to learn health information, and it's not a replacement for genealogical DNA tests. There are two important concepts to understand about how your autosomal DNA is inherited. First, you do not receive 100% of your parents' DNA or the DNA of your earlier ancestors. Looking at the percentages on this diagram, you can see that you get 50% of your DNA from each of your parents. Moving backward and further up the diagram, you get 25% from your grandparents, about 12.5% from your great-grandparents, about 6.25% from your second great-grandparents, and so on. You actually receive increasingly smaller amounts of DNA from each previous generation. Eventually, and sometimes as recently as your fourth great-grandparents, you get really vanishingly small amounts of those earlier ancestors' DNA. The colors in this chart are showing you how, in theory, you could inherit little different colored pieces of autosomal DNA from all of these many distant ancestors. The blue and the green colors are coming from your father's side, and the red and the yellow from your mother's side. There's a second important concept that I wanted to bring up too, and that is when you inherit your DNA from your parents, you do not receive an exact copy of just half of their DNA. What's passed down to you, that DNA is broken up into little segments and then randomly recombined. And it's this random recombination that really makes you unique, because without it, you and a sibling would actually be identical, unless, of course, you were already identical siblings to begin with. So before we dive into autosomal DNA, I want to take a moment to talk about the other kinds of DNA that can be tested. The first is Y-DNA. And Y-DNA is only found in males since the Y chromosome is not present in females. It follows your father's side, or the paternal line up the left-hand side of this tree. Y-DNA is most often used in genealogy to trace a male surname. If a female wants to trace her male surname, she needs to test her father or a brother or some other male relative that's in that family line. And Y-DNA can be passed down relatively unchanged, which means it has no mutations for hundreds to thousands of years. And it's these mutations or the lack of them that determine how closely you are related to a match. Currently, FamilyTreeDNA is the only company offering Y-DNA testing with matching. Mitochondrial DNA, which is not part of the chromosomes, is passed down relatively unchanged from a mother to all of her children. As a result, it follows your maternal line up the right-hand side of the tree. And it can be passed down with no mutations for actually thousands of years. And because it's so stable and there aren't any mutations that kind of help give us a clue of when, maybe how closely someone may be related. It's not as useful in genealogy research because most of our paper trails don't go back, you know, for thousands of years. So it's very difficult to find a common ancestor. And the changing of the female surnames in each generation can make it more difficult as well. FamilyTreeDNA is the only company that's currently offering mitochondrial DNA testing. Autosomal DNA is found on the 22 pairs of chromosomes, and as I said, it's the random recombination of DNA inherited from those ancestors in your family tree. And as I said, you get half from your father and half from your mother, and it's good because autosomal DNA can be useful in genealogy to identify relationships in this past 5 generations, or maybe out to about your second great grandparent or third cousin level. And then, as I mentioned, eventually those little tiny segments of DNA that you're inheriting from distant ancestors, they become too small to really be reliably identifiable. So it's usually about the 7th generation that the segments become so small that you really might not receive any DNA from your 7th or 8th generation ancestor. Or it could be that it's such a tiny, small amount that it's really hard to say, well, is this something that I got from that ancestor? Or is it just a coincidence that maybe I matched someone on this little tiny segment? And because of this, it means that you cannot use autosomal DNA to identify an ancestor from the 1600s. Because of the limitations of autosomal DNA, I strongly encourage you to test any of your older relatives whenever possible. So this will allow you to identify matches going further back in your family tree. For example, if you can test a parent or an aunt or an uncle, you are going back 5 generations in their family tree, which would actually be 6 generations in your family tree. Depending on the company you have tested with, you may see information about xDNA. And xDNA is found in both males and females. A father passes down his mother's X chromosome, the only X chromosome he has. A mother passes down a random combination of both of her X chromosomes. She has 2, but she can only pass down 1. Because of the way it's passed down, xDNA follows only certain maternal lines in your family tree. These 2 charts show how males and females inherit their xDNA a little bit differently. For example, if we look at the top chart for males, a man in the blue circle at the bottom of the chart inherits his xDNA from his mother, who's in pink, and she inherited it from both her father, who's in blue, and her mother in pink. And then you can kind of go back up the diagram, and anywhere it's shaded, those are places where that xDNA could be coming from. But in the bottom chart, a female inherits her xDNA a little bit differently because she actually receives 2 X chromosomes. And in both of these cases, someone can inherit their xDNA from these highlighted areas in these charts. And I've included a link in your handout so you can look at these charts more carefully if you want to. And also, some genealogy software programs will create these charts for you, and they'll actually fill in your ancestors' names in those highlighted places. So xDNA can be used in genealogy to help you focus on certain family lines. So if you have an xDNA match, then you should be related on one of the lines that are shown on these 2 charts. All of the companies test xDNA as part of their autosomal testing, but AncestryDNA and FamilyTreeDNA, they don't show you that on their website. There's no way that you can see it. So if you want to look, if you only tested at those companies to access that xDNA on those places, you would have to transfer it to a third-party site such as GEDmatch, or you could transfer it to, say, FamilyTreeDNA, and then you would be able to look at it there. And then there's one last concept that I want to leave you with. It's important to understand that not all of your ancestors for generation after generation are included in your DNA. So your genealogical family tree includes all of your ancestors going back tens and hundreds of generations. You know, I haven't, and you probably haven't identified all those ancestors in your research, but if, you know, in theory, if you could find enough information, you could go back many hundreds of years. But not everyone in your genealogical tree contributed to your individual DNA. That's because of that random recombination and that each generation doesn't inherit 100% of the DNA from each of their parents. So eventually, some ancestors are not represented in your DNA. And you can kind of think of that as your genetic tree. So that's what I'm trying to represent here with this chart. So the fan chart shows a tree that with boxes that go out to your 5th great-grandparent. And if this were your tree, and if you had enough information, you could put a name in each one of those boxes, and that would be your genealogical tree. And that kind of blue or gray shading in the chart, it shows how someone's DNA possibly could be inherited and how you might not inherit DNA from certain people. So the white boxes are those possible ancestors that maybe didn't contribute DNA to the person that's at the root of the tree. And so that shading represents a possible genetic tree. Now there's 100% probability of inheriting DNA from your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and your second great-grandparents. But after that, the probabilities begin to drop a bit. You actually only have a 95% chance of inheriting DNA from your 5th great-grandparents and less than a 50% chance from your 8th great-grandparents. And by the time you reach your 10th great-grandparents, you only have a 15% chance of inheriting any of their DNA. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this genealogical versus genetic tree concept is that it plays a role in our next topic, which is ethnicity estimates. Everyone loves to look at their ethnicity estimates, and this is often a major way that DNA tests are marketed. But because you only have those snippets of DNA from some of the more distant ancestors and possibly none from others, it's really hard for the companies to determine your ethnicity 100% accurately. And that's why we like to call them estimates. And although widely advertised, these ethnicity estimates are actually the least reliable part of a DNA test and should not be considered 100% accurate. To determine your ethnicity, the DNA testing companies compare your DNA to reference panels of DNA. And these reference panels are made up of samples of DNA from living people found in regions around the world. And these people in the reference panels, they each have a documented paper trail that shows they have ancestors that lived in that particular area for many generations. And then their DNA is compared to others from the same region. And if they all have enough similarity, they're included in that particular reference panel. And each of the testing companies has different samples from different regions. That's another reason that you will see different results if you've tested at different companies. For example, the last time I checked, Ancestry had just over 40,000 DNA samples that divided the world into 60 overlapping regions. You can kind of see that in the picture here. However, not every region or every small ethnic group is covered in these examples. And that can be another reason that you'll see different results across the companies. And the companies, they like to update your ethnicity results from time to time. This can be because maybe they've added more samples to the reference panel, or sometimes they've actually changed their algorithms that they use to figure out which ethnicity you might have. To estimate your ethnicity, each company uses their own proprietary algorithm to determine which region or group to assign you to. This can be important if your DNA doesn't closely match DNA from a particular area. So instead of maybe being assigned to a country in Europe, you may be considered part of a regional area. So sometimes in my results, I have a lot of German, and sometimes it won't say Germany. It will just have this kind of broad area that covers Germany and other parts of Europe that are near that German area. And then it's important to think about, well, what if you have a really unique ethnicity and it's not found in a reference panel? What the company usually does is they kind of lump you into an even broader region covering an even larger area. But don't let the label for a region be confusing. You try to find the maps that the company has and look at the company's ethnicity estimates about where those regions are and what countries they are covering. This is an example from MyHeritage, and they actually have 42 regions that kind of overlap different areas. The different company algorithms are also important to consider as they determine the possible time frame for when an ethnicity from a region or a country may have appeared in your heritage. So most companies say the results can show heritage back to around 1,000 or more years ago, but the different reference panels can sometimes bring this a little bit closer, maybe to 500 years or less. And Ancestry and 23andMe seem to be the two companies that show your ethnicity more within the last 500 years versus maybe 500 to 1,000 years ago. And this is an example from 23andMe for my ethnicity estimates. And it shows the different ethnic groups that supposedly I have appeared in my background. So my background, as far as I've been able to determine, is about half German and about half English or British Isles. And my most recent immigrant ancestors are from Germany. And that actually seems to kind of line up with this timeline. And it kind of shows that my more recent ancestors were German or French and German, or that area in that part of Europe. And then their British ancestors, or maybe, British Isles. And then maybe some really earlier ancestors from other areas in Europe. But I have to say, I have not found any Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, or Balkan ancestors in my research yet. So here's an example of how the ethnicity results can differ at the different testing companies. As I said, I'm about half German and half English or British Isles, and each of the testing companies shows that I have different possible percentages of German and English DNA. Some are pretty close to half and half, but 23andMe shows more German and less English than the other companies, and each company has a different idea about some of those trace amounts of DNA. Ancestry shows maybe a 1% Indigenous American. I'm thinking that might be coming from an ancestor that I have one French Canadian line, and maybe there was some mixing with some Native Americans up in Canada. I'm not sure. But the other companies seem to think that I may have some Spanish or Southern European ancestry, and even maybe a little bit of Middle Eastern. So you can see there's a wide range of how these ethnicity estimates may be shown to you. Let's move on to DNA matches. As I mentioned before, once you submit a DNA sample to one of the DNA testing companies, they compare your DNA to everyone else who is tested at that company. And then they report the resulting matches they have found back to you, and they predict how closely you may be related to your match. And these matches are your DNA cousins, and you do share a common ancestor somewhere in your past. You may have heard that these ancestors referred to as your most recent common ancestor or ancestral couple. And you and your match descend through different children of this ancestor or ancestral couple. So to determine how closely you and a DNA match are related, the companies compare how many centimorgans of DNA you have in common. The higher or the larger amount of centimorgans, the more closely you are related. To understand more about centimorgans, you can use this great resource that was created by Blaine Bettinger called the Shared Centimorgan Project, and I've included a link to it in your handout. It depicts the amount of centimorgans that you might share with each type of relationship all the way back to about your fifth cousins or a little bit further. And the DNA companies predict your relationship to a match based on the amount of DNA that you share. And the amount that you can share with each person or at a different relationship can actually range pretty widely. For example, if we look at the chart where the red arrow is pointing for a first cousin, you can see that on average you share 866 centimorgans of DNA in common, but that can actually range from a low of about 396, maybe as high as 1,397. Now, don't worry about trying to remember these centimorgans things. I just wanted to show you how the predictions work based on the amount of centimorgans that you have in common. All of the companies will show predicted relationships. And I've highlighted these in the red boxes in this example from AncestryDNA. You can see the first two people in my match list. The first is my mother, Judy, and she's predicted to be either my parent or my child. The testing company actually can't tell which, but they know she's a very close immediate family member because we share so much DNA in common. The next match, named Priscilla, is predicted to be my first to second cousin. And just a quick side note, in this and all the other examples, I've either changed the names of my matches or redacted their information to predict their privacy. At FamilyTreeDNA, I've also tested my mother, who's named Judith here, and I've actually tested my uncle, who's Dr. James, and I have an aunt named Mary Alice as well that I've tested there. And their predicted relationships include different possibilities. Again, the testing company doesn't know that they are my aunt and my uncle. Instead, they suggest we could be half siblings or a grandparent or a grandchild or an aunt and an uncle or even a niece or a nephew. So those are all those possible relationships based on the amount of centimorgans that we share. I have to use my knowledge about my family to know which is the correct relationship. And then the last person in this example, Silas, is just predicted to be my second to fourth cousin. At FamilyTreeDNA, once I've determined the correct relationship, if I want, I can update that linked relationship field that you can see in the red box. And then I can add the correct relationship. And it turns out, in this case, that Silas is actually a second cousin once removed. Now you can see from these examples from Ancestry and FamilyTreeDNA that the companies show the data in different ways, but they also provide different tools, and we're going to take a look at some of those next. To get the most out of the tools provided at the testing companies, you actually need to provide some information for the company to work with. I've provided information in your handout specifically for each of the testing companies. But the most important things are that you need to have some kind of a tree at the testing company. Hopefully it's pretty well researched and documented, or at least it includes you and all your direct ancestors and as many of your collateral relatives as possible. Now, all the companies provide some way to either create a tree on their site, or you can link to a tree at another site that's specifically at 23andMe. But if you prefer to keep your research offline, like I do, I tend to keep mine on my laptop. What I do is I create a GEDCOM from that software program, and then I can just upload it to that particular testing company. And any of the software programs will have an option to create a GEDCOM, and then that's sometimes the easiest way to do that if you want. And it's fine for that tree. You don't have to have all your sources and notes in that GEDCOM. But as I said, it should be your direct line ancestors, so all of your grandparents and that kind of thing, and all of those collateral relatives, like your aunts and your uncles, anyone that you figured out. Because in many cases, your matches will be descendants of those collateral relatives. So if you know their names, particularly their surnames, it's going to be a lot easier to figure out how you are related to those DNA matches. It's also important to link your test results to yourself and your tree. This is especially true at Ancestry, MyHeritage, and FamilyTreeDNA. You should also update your profile and add as much information as possible. You might want to include the surnames or locations that you're researching. And this is going to allow your matches to learn a little bit about you and your family history, the same kind of things that you would like to learn about your matches when you're looking at them. Since so many people have taken an AncestryDNA test, I'm going to go through the tools that they provide first. And then we'll look at some of the tools at the other companies. So just to let you know, Ancestry and the other companies occasionally update their websites and layouts. So I've tried to put the most recent screenshots in here, but you may see slight variations when you look at your DNA results and compare them to what I'm showing you today. When you look at your match list on Ancestry, one of the first tools you may see is their common ancestor hint. They provide this hint based on information in your tree and your matches tree. The hint is only available for matches who have linked their DNA results to an ancestry tree. Now, the tree can either be public or a searchable private tree, but they have to have a tree. If you click on the common ancestor hint, you can actually get more information. And then using this information, you can decide if you feel that this hint is correct. So let's take a look at that last match in my list called Dale 21. When I click on Dale 21 and I look at the information that Ancestry provides, you can see in the red box, it says that according to Ancestry member trees, there are common ancestors that connect you in Dale 21. View a common ancestor to see the relationship path that connects you. So in this case, Dale could be my second cousin through Michael Cyrillus Yeagle or Edith Isabel Ritter. And Michael and Edith's place in Dale 21's tree are also highlighted in green by Ancestry, and that's what that red arrow is pointing to. Now, to see the suggested relationship path, all you have to do is click on one of the possible common ancestors in that left-hand box. You can click on, it doesn't matter which one, either Michael or Edith, and I'm going to choose Michael for this example. And you get something that looks a little bit like this. So Ancestry predicts that myself and Dale 21 share the same great-grandparent, Michael C. Yeagle. Using information from both of our trees, Ancestry shows the possible relationship path. And they also refine the prediction and say that looks like we're second cousins. But I can't take this as fact. It's up to me to validate this information before I can say it's true. It's possible that Ancestry has made a mistake trying to predict our relationship. It's possible that Dale 21's tree or my tree has incorrect information. So I need to look in both of our trees for more information to support this prediction. And if a tree is missing information, I actually may need to do my own research to verify the suggested relationship. Another tool Ancestry provides is their groups feature. You can see in this example those colored dots next to some of my matches. These are groups that I have created and that I have assigned to my matches. If you click on that groups button, you can see all the groups that you have created. So these are things that you have to do yourself. Ancestry isn't doing this for you. In this example, I have set up a number of groups with different colored dots. And for each of these different colors, I've decided to name it for a person or an ancestral couple from my tree. And then when I figure out how a match and myself are related, I can assign that match to the appropriate group. And the good thing about this is then you can use those groups to help you figure out other matches. You might even have maybe a mystery group for people that you're just curious about but haven't figured out how you're related. And these groups make it really easy to kind of quickly scan through your match list and help you sort them out. And they're really good for when you're working with shared matches. So let's take a look at this example. I've selected a group with the red dot that I've named my Moore and Pratt ancestors for those particular grandparent lines. And the matches that I figured out are descendants of those people I've assigned to that group by giving them one of those red dots. And the resulting list, it only shows those matches that I have assigned to that group. So there could be other people that are related to me on this line, but I just have not assigned them to that group yet. But as I said, assigning your known matches to a group can really help when you're trying to figure out your unknown matches. So if we go back to that example for Dale 21, you can see that in that red box, I've actually assigned him to a group with a green dot. And you can see that there's a tab that's called Shared Matches, and that's where that red arrow is pointing. And if I click on that, it will show me all of the matches that share DNA with both of myself and Dale 21. And when I look at that list of shared matches, I can see that the last match in the list, called Karina here, currently has no colored dot by her name. Now, since she does not have a tree, it may be difficult to figure out how we're related. But since she shares DNA with Dale 21, there's a good chance that she's related to me and Dale through ancestors on that same green dot ancestral line. Since she's possibly a 4th to 6th cousin, this may mean we have very distant ancestors on one of those lines, and it could be really difficult to figure out how we're related. But these shared matches are a great tool when trying to figure out how you and a match are related. So when you figure out a match, always look at your shared matches to find others who should be related on the same lines. And when you have a match you do not know the relationship for, you can check those shared matches. And you may actually then see people in that shared match list that you do know how you're related to. And that can really kind of help you figure things out. Now, all the testing companies will show you shared matches. I also want to point out some other ways that Ancestry helps you to work with your matches. Since I've tested my mother, I've linked her test to the appropriate place in my ancestry tree for her. So that means that there's that little icon where the red arrow is pointing to, it shows that she's, it looks like a little pedigree tree with a check mark in it. That just shows that I've linked her DNA results to into my tree. And if you do enough of those, sometimes it's useful for Ancestry to help you, help them assign different matches to different sides of your tree. And in this case, because it's my mother, they're able to show me matches that are on my mother's side. Now, I haven't tested my father, so I don't have a father's side. And we can see that Karina at the bottom of the list is actually on my mother's side. So this is another clue that might help me figure out how Karina and I are related. The last tool at Ancestry that I'm going to talk about is Through Lines. What this tool does is it combs through all of those ancestry trees that are out there, and it tries to suggest how you may be related to your DNA matches through common ancestors. And since it's using many different trees to make these suggestions, it's possible some of those trees are incorrect. So as a result, the suggestions may not always be correct, and you need to review them very carefully. Once you select the Through Lines tool, it will give you a list of all of your ancestors in your tree, or that's in your own tree that you've created. And it may even suggest ancestors that you have not yet identified. And that's based on information found in other trees. So let's look at this Ancestry, what Ancestry suggests when I click on my second great grandfather named James Michael Yeagle. It's a visual tree, and it shows how I could be related to my DNA matches through James Michael Yeagle. This includes my mother and Dale 21, who we've already seen. And it's also possible that Karen on the far left is my third cousin and descends from a brother of my second great-grandfather, Michael C. Yeagle. And then John and Lynn, and so there's a John Lynn and Michael C. They appear to share James Michael Yeagle as their father. And again, I need to review the information in Karen and my trees carefully before I conclude that this is the actual correct relationship. Another feature of through lines is that they attempt to find potentially new ancestors for you. Again, these are people who are in someone else's ancestry tree, but Ancestry suggests maybe they belong in your tree. So let's look at Johann Baer, who they think could be my fourth great-grandfather. And when I click on him, it shows in my ancestry tree that I have a Carl F. Baer as my third great-grandfather, and it's possible that Carl's father was named Johann. I also have 4 DNA matches, but they all descend from Carl, so they're not really helping with the Johann thing. But I can click on the matches to expand the tree and maybe learn how they fit in. Maybe they're related through different children of Carl. And I can also click on the Evaluate button to learn more about Johann with the information that Ancestry's found in those different trees. And then I can decide if I want to include him in my ancestry tree. I might need to conduct my own independent research before I say for sure he's my fourth great-grandfather. Now we're going to move on to MyHeritage. And MyHeritage does not have all the same tools that we just saw in Ancestry. However, they do have one tool that's very similar to Ancestry's through lines and their common ancestor hint. And this tool is called the Theory of Family Relativity. And again, it provides a visual representation of how you and a match could be related, but it includes more information about the trees that they're using for the suggestion, and it actually has a confidence level. So if you look at where the red arrow is pointing, MyHeritage says that there's an 82% confidence that the Edward Morel in my tree is the same Edward Morel that's in Kim's tree. And if you look at the information that I've highlighted in that red box at the top left, you can see that there are even 2 possible paths of how we could be related. So I'd want to check both those paths, to see, well, what is the differences? Well, how are they coming up with these different ways that we could be related? And again, just like Ancestry, these are hints, and I need to evaluate the information carefully and make my own conclusions. But MyHeritage does have a very unique tool called Auto Clusters, and it's actually found on their DNA Tools tab. And what it does is it looks at your DNA matches and it tries to organize them into clusters of matches that likely descend from a common ancestor. So when you click on that Auto Clusters tool, if you actually have more than one test available, you have to select which one you want it for. And then it generates a report, and it actually takes anywhere from a few minutes to maybe an hour if you have a huge number of matches. And once it's done, you actually get an email, and it has a zip file that has 3 files in it. One is an HTML file, so you get a pretty picture like you see in this example. And you get a CSV file, which is a spreadsheet of all your matches. And then you get a README file with information, so maybe you can read that to help you understand what's going on. And this is just an example of a possible Auto Clusters report that's shown here. So each of those colored blocks, like the red and then the orange and then the yellow, they represent possible common ancestors for these different matches. And then each of the cells that are in those color blocks, those are intersections between 2 of your matches. Now, in theory, this means if you could determine how you were related to one of the matches in the color cluster, you are likely related to the other matches through that same ancestral line. And it's kind of a fun tool to play around with. And AutoClusters is actually available for matches on 23andMe and FamilyTreeDNA too, because you can't get to it from the testing company's websites. You'd have to go to a website called Genetic Affairs, and in your handout, there's some more information about that. Now, unfortunately, you cannot get AutoCluster matches for Ancestry. And that's because Ancestry is actually blocking Genetic Affairs from working with their website because they say it overtaxes their servers. Now let's take a look at 23andMe. Now they have not as many tools, but they do have one specialty tool that's kind of fun to look at, and it's called FamilyTree. You'll actually find this on the Family and Friends tab, where it's labeled Family Tree, and then you can see that where the red arrow is pointing. And what this tool does, it predicts a family tree based on the DNA you share with your matches at 23andMe. Now, when you opt in at 23andMe and participate in DNA relatives, or if you've already done this one-to-one connection with some of your matches, what 23andMe does is it compares your DNA and ages, and sometimes it gets some information if you have a tree linked to the results, and it predicts the possible genetic relationships. Now, this is still a work in progress, and I've actually seen some mistakes where it's actually missing maybe a whole generation. And some of the information here on 23andMe, I know it's getting that from a link that I provided to my ancestry tree. So that's where it's getting some of the names and the pictures for those people in my direct ancestors that are in yellow. And the ones in pink are my paternal line on the left, and these are the ones that they think maybe that's how I could be related to those matches. And the ones in blue are the paternal line on the right. So again, these are just suggestions, but they're a great place to start when I'm trying to figure out how I could be related to my matches. Besides the specialty tools at the testing companies, and looking at those shared matches, which can be a really great thing to do, there are a couple of other ways to work with your DNA matches. These include checking for surnames in common and checking for locations in common. So let's take a look at examples from each of these, and I'll go through a couple of quick examples. So some companies make it easier to find shared surnames than others. This is an example from FamilyTreeDNA, and what they'll do is they'll actually try to highlight the surnames that are in common. Now, this feature will only work if the surnames are spelled similarly enough, and if you and a match have provided surnames, or if there's a tree available that that FamilyTreeDNA can look in to find those surnames. In this example for Lynn, we share the common surname Benke, and they bolded that in the box that I highlighted in red. And I saw that Lynn had provided a family tree, which was indicated by that little blue icon. And when I clicked on that, I could see in her tree, I could look in her tree, and I found her Benke names. And this included a couple named Johann Benke and Christian Bier. And I actually recognized those names because they were in my tree as well. So Johann and Christine are my second great grandparents. And it turns out that Lynn and I are third cousins, and our common ancestors are this couple. And Lynn and I have been in contact through email, and she was delighted to learn more about the Benke family, especially as I had researched it back to Germany. And I got to learn all about her Benke ancestors that descended from a different daughter, and they were a family line that my family had lost track of and we didn't know anything about. So in both cases, we got to learn new information, and it was really fun. On Ancestry, they don't make it as obvious how these shared surnames are in common. But in this example from Mike, I really don't see much information. We don't have a common ancestor hint or anything like that. But what I do like is that he has a public linked tree, and there are over 700 people in it. So this makes it much more likely to find common surnames. So I'm going to view this match and see what else we can learn. And then this is the information I see when I look at Mike's match. I can see he has this linked tree and the ancestors he has in that tree. I assume Mike is the root person marked private. That's who Ancestry is showing the linked tree starting with. But be careful with these unlinked trees. The DNA tester may not actually be the root person. What I could do is I could just look through the tree to see if I recognize surnames. But when you're at this level, Ancestry does try to do this for me. And down below the tree, you will see any shared surnames that Ancestry has found. But sometimes they don't show them all, so sometimes it's good to kind of take a quick look through the tree. In this case, they found Benke surnames, a name I recognize. And Ancestry will also highlight a shared surname in the tree if it's one of the direct ancestors. In this case, Mike has an ancestor named Lena Benke, but he doesn't have the name of her parents. So now it's up to me to figure out if Lena, how she fits into my Benke family, or even if she does. I mean, it could just be a coincidence. So first, I would check my family tree to see if she happens to be a child of one of the Benke people that I have already researched. If she is not, it could mean that maybe I've missed someone in my Benke research and I'll have to do some more digging. What I can do is I can look in Mike's tree to learn what he knows about Lena and to see if there's any more details there. And as I said, if I can't connect Lena to my Benke family, it could mean that it's just a common surname by coincidence. But in this case, I'd have to do a little bit more research to see if there was a different connection, if that was the case. But it turns out Lena is another child of Johann and Christine. And then using this information that I have found in my research and the information in Mike's tree, it turns out that we're actually third cousins like Glenn, who we just saw a few minutes ago. So these two examples show how to look for surnames in common and how to try and figure out how a match fits into your tree. It may not always be obvious. You may need to do more research on your match's lines to make the connection. But common surnames are a great place to start looking when you're trying to figure out how you were related to your DNA matches. Now let's see how finding locations in common can help when working with your DNA matches. First, you need to find the information on those locations that you and a match may share. The testing companies don't always have the best tools for this, but sometimes they may show some location information. On Ancestry, for example, you can see what birth locations are the same in you and a match's tree, and you can find this at the bottom of the match comparison page, sort of below if you had where those common surnames were. But you may actually want to look at a match's tree for locations as well. This is true especially if you're interested in maybe a marriage or a death location. And it can be a good idea maybe to check a match's profile. Sometimes they will have included information about specific locations that they are researching, or maybe locations that their ancestors came from. Here's an example from FamilyTreeDNA for my mother-in-law, May. Now she has Irish ancestors that I would like to learn more about. For this match named Patrick, I checked the match's profile and saw that he had included information on ancestral surnames and locations for those surnames and where they came from. And this included multiple Skibbereen locations in County Cork. And I underlined those in red so you can kind of see this a little bit easier. And this got my attention because May's paternal grandfather was from the Skibbereen area in County Cork. But when I looked at the surnames in common, I didn't see any surnames that were in the match and in May's tree. And so I took a look at, but when I looked at Patrick's tree, I was actually able to get more detailed information. And a couple of the births were actually in places that had much more specific names. And a couple of them, one was called Tureen and another was Kilskahana. And again, I didn't recognize these areas, but I thought, well, I'm going to look at a map and see where they are. And you can see where I've highlighted those in those two red boxes on the right. And when I looked at that, I said, wait a minute, that's really close to where May's ancestors were from. Her people were from a little place called Lizalurig, and it was only a few miles south of where Turin and Kilscahana are. And these places are all just very close to the town of Skibbereen. So this was interesting because I'm like, you know, these people are all coming from the same area, but there was a problem. May doesn't have any ancestors that had the surname of Collins or Donovan or Horahan or McCarthy that I found in her tree. But I took another look at her family that was from that Lizalurig area, and I did find those surnames as baptismal sponsors for some of those Lizalurig family members. Now, often these godparents in Catholic families were close family members like cousins. So maybe there is a connection somewhere that I just haven't discovered yet. So this DNA match and the dates and locations in common mean I found a place that I need to do more research on. Now, there's no guarantee that Patrick and May are actually related through these ancestors, but now I've got a place to start looking, you know, and sometimes that's the hardest thing. Well, where do I start? I may need to contact this match and maybe learn more and see if he knows any more. Maybe he has a more detailed family tree that I could look at. And then I probably need to do more research in the May's family tree. But the profile information for this match said that Patrick lived in Ireland. So it actually might be nice to learn if he has any maybe stories from his ancestors, what their lives were like from this particular area, because they would also be very similar to what May's ancestors may have experienced. On 23andMe, you can also see if there are any locations entered by your match. In this example for my match named Cheryl, I saw we both had Pennsylvania locations. She also matches my mother, so I know we share maternal ancestors. Now, the only Pennsylvania ancestor I have on my mother's side is my third great-grandfather, who was a Pennsylvania German. Can Cheryl and I be related through this line? Possibly. I looked at her family tree and I saw some specific locations in Pennsylvania for her ancestors that had German surnames. And I actually recognized some of those locations. It turns out I have the same locations in my tree for my German ancestors that were from that same time period. Another thing that got me excited was I saw this Hetrick surname in her tree. Now, my Pennsylvania German family actually traveled with a family that was named Hetrick when they moved from Pennsylvania to Ohio. I don't actually have any Hetrick ancestors that I know of, but I'm actually very interested in learning more about her Hetrick family from this area of Pennsylvania. This is really true because my Pennsylvania Germans are one of my brick walls, and I still, haven't really figured out how Cheryl and I are related. But if I concentrate my research on these locations in our families, maybe at some point I'll make some progress on my brick wall. So we're getting to the end, but I just want to give you a couple of other things that can really be helpful when you're working with your matches. It can actually get confusing after a while when you're trying to figure out how your matches are connected. So I strongly recommend keeping track of the information in some way. Each of the testing companies has a way to write notes to yourself. And you can use these to record confirmed or possible common ancestors or information that that your match gave you about their family. These are just two examples. The top one is from FamilyTreeDNA, and this is where I figured out a relationship and I put that information in the notes field. And the bottom is from MyHeritage, where I have a match named Colin. And I haven't figured out our exact relationship yet. But in the notes field, I put as much information as I have. And this includes that I know he's a maternal match, and I discovered he matches me on a German Jaeger line. And I sometimes use a program called DNA Painter, so I added that information as well. And now, whenever I look at Colin's this match in the future, I can look at my notes and I know like where I left off, and this can make it easier for me to kind of pick up my research later in the future. And on Ancestry, don't forget about the groups feature. This is another great way to keep track of information you're learning about your matches. You can assign matches to groups that you have created for different lines or possible ancestors or just about anything that you want. And when you do this and look at just those matches that you've assigned to a group, you can kind of quickly focus in on a subset of your matches. So I know there's been a lot of information to take in during this talk, but I wanted to leave you with these key concepts. Make sure to provide a family tree at your testing site. You should also update your profile with information. This can include maybe the main surnames that you're researching or locations that you're interested in. Explore and use the different tools available. These could be like Ancestry's Common Ancestor Hints or MyHeritage's Theory of Family Relativity. When working with your matches, look for surnames in common and look for locations in common. And finally, keep track of the information you're finding out. Always use the notes option at the testing company because you don't want to lose track of all this research you did or forget what you've discovered. I want to thank you for joining me tonight, and I hope you have good success and fun figuring out your DNA matches. So we have time for questions. I'll stop sharing. Just looking through this chat to see if anyone has a question.
So Pam, there's one from Peg asking
Okay.
about private DNA consultation with you.
Hi, Pam.
Yeah, so I mean, you could hire me as a private, you could be my private client, unless you were an NAHGS member, because then you would have to go through NAHGS.
And I
But I
am.
could do that, yes. You are muted.
Oh,
What were you saying?
I said I am a member.
Okay.
Since 1999, so I will call the mothership and talk to them.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Gina's asking, what are some tips to keep in mind when looking at a matches tree and trying to determine if it's well put together and reliable?
Well, I mean, you can look to see if they have any sources attached to it, or if it's just links to lots of other ancestry trees. You know, and sometimes it's, you can replicate the information that they have. You might be able to determine, like if they have the names of parents, maybe you can find them on a census record, and that can be a way to validate the information.
Any other questions for Pam?
This is Janet. I have a question. Do you recommend, if my mother I had her do the AncestryDNA, which I had done, and my father has passed, but I have a paternal aunt, my father's sister. Do you recommend doing it with the same company, AncestryDNA, or do you recommend using a different company to get a more rounded additional?
Well, if you're just going to do Ancestry, I would do Ancestry again. Ancestry has the most testers. I think they currently have over 20 million test takers. They have the most tools. And then because your mother's already tested there, it will help you kind of sort out like if it's a maternal or a paternal line. Now, I didn't really go into it, but what you can do is you can transfer for free. You can download your raw DNA results from any of the companies, and then you could transfer it for free to FamilyTreeDNA and MyHeritage. And then you can pay a small unlocking fee. I think it's like 19 at FamilyTreeDNA and 29 at MyHeritage if you want to use their more advanced tools. So that's another way to get your DNA at different company databases, because there might be different testers at the different companies. I know MyHeritage has a lot more people from Ireland that tend to test. So I've made sure that my Irish in-laws have their DNA results there.
Okay. Thank you.
There's a question from Marion. I show possible ancestors in South Carolina. My parents are from Ireland, however. How would I go about locating these ancestors, the Carolina ancestors?
Well, I mean, you know, it could be that there are people that you just don't know about in your tree, or it could be that there are collateral relatives that came from Ireland potentially and came over and ended up in North Carolina. So it could be that you just have to go further back in both of their trees to find those common ancestors. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you. It's one of these things I can't remember which database, but they just show you like geographic locations. And given my family's right from Ireland, it has to be an earlier ancestor, but I haven't ever really seen one, but I'm sure it's in there somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. On my father-in-law's side of, he's Irish. He's 100% Irish, but he has a ton of matches here in the United States. So I know that way back, you know, his fourth or fifth grandparent, some of those kids came over and have descendants here, and that's how he's matching them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm not seeing any other questions. Is there anyone that wants to unmute and ask directly? It's a happy crowd. So Pam, I have one line that goes that I know pretty well going back like 10 generations, and then another line maybe 5 or 6, but not so much on my mother's side of the family. If you wanted to pick just one company, is there one that you would pick, or does it depend on?
Well, I mean, I would suggest to start with Ancestry, just because they have such a large pool of test takers. So you're much more likely to find someone that you match and that will have a tree that will help you.
Okay.
And they often have sales. I know they just had one for Father's Day. They may have another one for 4th of July or something like that. So
Checking back then. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I think we'll wrap it up then. Thank you so much, Pam. This has been great. It's very helpful.
great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.